Well, I'm joined today by the one and the only Sidney Dekker. I don't think he needs much of an introduction. He's a best-selling author, obviously into human factors and safety. He's also a pilot. Good morning, Sidney. Well, good morning to you. It's good afternoon for me.
Hey there, Sam.
How are things treating you today?
No, it's all good. Thank you, my friend. It's a strange situation, obviously, for everyone right now. But, you and I can claim that we still have sort of a job. So, and that's probably not true for all the listeners, I would assume. So good luck to all you folks out there.
No, absolutely. Thank you once again for joining us. We were just chatting a little bit before we started, and we're just happy to have you here. I'm look forward to picking your brain a little bit. To level with you, you have been the most requested person for the podcast. So you were here. I'm sure people are going to be excited. It's going to be great. So a lot of the questions that I'm going to kind of ask to you are really stuff that folks have kind of sent over, or common questions that they have. And just to level with you, a lot of it is in and around just culture. Okay. So a lot of conversation there. One of the biggest things that we hear, a significant amount of leaders, managers, and executives, they tend to toss around words like accountability and responsibility. And what they often mean is really culpability, or the use of the stick, some means of extracting punishment upon wrongdoers within the organization. You know, somebody that was complacent or didn't follow the rules. Many of those leaders, they feel that that's needed for some reason. They feel that they'll lose control without carrying a big stick. What would you share with those leaders? How could we go down a different path?
Oh, Sam, where to start? No, but the big questions are good. Big questions are good. Complex problems are the most interesting ones. The first one I want to recommend to them is to stop peeing in your pants management, right? And so what that means is, anybody who's had kids probably has seen this happen in their kid, right? You go, oh, I think the kid's got to go, right? And then there's no opportunity to let the kid go. And you go, oh my God, how are we going to solve this? And the kid looks increasingly scrunched up, and oh man, I have to do something, right? And you go, no. And then the kid lets go, and it clatters on through the street or wherever it ends up. And so I see the same sort of behavior in leaders who feel they have to take a stand or do something or respond to the latest sign of some deviation that they want to make an example of, or make very clear that they draw the line there and there is a boundary to be patrolled. But the problem with that sort of peeing in your pants management is, you feel relieved and satisfied that you've done something, just like the kid that let go. But once it's out, 30 seconds later, two things happen, right? First, you begin to stink. And second, you start to look like a fool, right? And so hold it in. That's the first recommendation. Hold it in. Don't respond without a serious learning review, right? And I'm sure a lot in the HOP community know exactly what I'm talking about. Don't think in terms of investigation, because that word gives you all the wrong sort of hints, right? Investigation. That means, there's probably somebody culpable and something went wrong, and that's a cause, and that cause can be traced back to a culpable human being. No, it's a learning review. Nobody comes to work to do a bad job. Nobody comes to work to do a bad job, Sam. And that's the, that really is the alpha and the omega of the HOP community. If we cannot gather around that basic principle of what Jens Rasmussen and everyone back in the 70s started calling local rationality. Right? People do what makes sense to them at the time, given their circumstances, given their goals that they've been given by the organization that they work for, given the focus of attention, given the constraints and time pressures and everything they're working under, and the imperfect designs that are probably error inviting rather than error intolerant. If people come to work to do a good job and that's your starting point, then you can never start an investigation thinking, I'm going to find the culpable one, because there is nobody culpable, right? People, if people were doing what they wanted to do, they'd probably be sitting home on the couch having a beer or something, right? They wouldn't be working for you. Right? They're doing your job. They're solving your problems. They're helping you make money, So from that perspective, Man, I'm on a rant already,
No, keep going.
well, yeah, but but leaders probably. I mean, I know what they're going to say. They're going to say, yeah. I mean, that's all really cute, Dekker, but I have to hold somebody accountable, because otherwise I'm not seen as a leader.
Right.
I think that is absolute masculine nonsense.
Absolutely.
It is BS.
Right.
You can be seen as a leader when you are compassionate, when you actually give a damn about the people who come to work to do work for you. You can be seen as a really strong leader if you suspend your judgment, if you don't jump in and do something because you feel, you believe, you have this myth in your head that you need to be seen to be doing something. Nonsense. Great leaders ponder. I mean, go back to the Greeks 2,500 years ago. I mean, the greatest leaders weren't the ones who shot from the hip. Well, there's none to shoot from the hip with, but they weren't those sorts of guys. They were the guys who were thinking, and when you look at the philosophies those guys come up with, Stoicism, for example, it was born on the battlefield. Right, it wasn't sort of thought up in some nice little cozy chamber where you could sit and drink and eat your grapes or something. No, it was born in the battlefield. But they found out that in those heated situations, those moments where there's lots of time pressure, critical things going on, the one that emerges as the leader is the one who's able to step back and say, "All right, let's take a breath. All right. I am not going to be standing here pissing in my pants because I need to be seen to be doing something, because I don't want to be the one ending up who stinks and looks like a fool."
Right. How much of that mindset comes from the organization's really underlying beliefs around human error?
Yeah, it's a good question, Sam. And in fact, I'd like to blow that out and say it's not just the organization's beliefs. I think it is, in a sense, the culture's or country's belief.
Sure.
And because there is a significant difference when I travel. Well, okay, for the record, I'm not traveling at all. But it's
a welcome to break at the moment, right?
Yeah, I'm writing another book, so that's so that's what you do in the break. But I used to travel a lot across all kinds of different countries, and there is something specific that the particularly North Americans and you guys, I mean the U.S. more than Canada, believe about human choice and freedom of human choice, right? And it is part of your founding myth. It is part of the myth of the country that you are, and which makes you such an attractive, both destination and target, and depending on who you ask. But Max Weber, the German sociologist that came to visit, right, more than 100 years ago, he saw this and he described it as sort of the Protestant ethic. I think the Catholics did it as well, and the Jewish community in the U.S. But the idea that if you and he found it to be much. I'll explain in a second what it is, but what he thought it was. But he found it to be present in a much stronger way in the U.S. than in all of his work in Europe. So he comes in and he sees a country that is organized around individual choice, and the idea that if you are successful in life, it is because you made good choices and you expended a lot of hard effort and you put in the hard yards and you did your best. And effort pays off. I mean, this has always been the idea underneath the American dream, right? Which has come under severe pressure, as we all know. And statistically, there is no such thing anymore, compared to other countries that are much better at having an American dream, like Denmark. But never mind. They have an inscrutable language, so that's not an option for most. But the idea behind the American dream is that effort pays off, right? Now, the flip side of that is that if you are unsuccessful, if you end up in a bad situation, an incident, and broken stuff in your hands, and you look and go, how the hell did that happen? Very quickly, that very script of this Protestant ethic that Weber saw more than 100 years ago turns into poor choices by the individual that led to the outcome. Right. And there is much less of a tendency in the US to look for attenuating circumstances in the environment that actually produce the behavior in question. And that will, if you leave it there, produce the behavior in question again, which is, of course, where the HOP community comes in, right? And as I wrote, in the Field Guide to Understanding Human Error 20 years ago, you can either fire someone, which doesn't fix anything, or actually learn. You can punish or learn. You can sanction or learn. You got to make the choice, right? And the HOP communities pick this up. and elevated it to its mantra, which is beautiful,
Right.
right? That you can, firing fixes nothing. You can either punish or learn. And I said this 20 years ago, and so and I'm sure that many of the hop nerds have read the field guide, and if they haven't, they better.
That's one of the first recommended readings that I pass on to people. Actually,
it's the entry. Yeah,
I started kind of backwards. I had the opportunity to hang out with Todd Conklin a while back, and that's what I'd shared with him is that the first book that I read that started me down this path was actually Safety Differently, and not one of his. And he got quite the kick out of that I started with Safety Differently.
Which is a behemoth. It's a terrible book, Sam. It's definitely not what I'd recommend. Wow, you're a masochist.
I'm a nerd.
You're a nerd. This is true. No, but I would not recommend people who haven't had any contact with this stuff to read Safety Differently. Right. It was a necessary book, right, to lay out the theoretical depth and the scholarship behind all the ideas, and so. I'm not apologizing for the existence of the book, but as an entry-level text, it wouldn't meet that criterion.
Well, it's interesting as we kind of talked about those underlying assumptions around human error, and really to oversimplify, viewing human error as a choice in most situations, and many organizations still hold that belief that people choose to make errors. That naturally leads us down this path that bad things happen to bad people. Right, that if kind of to the point that if people would have only cared more, tried harder, paid more attention, then the bad outcome would have never happened. And that seems to naturally lead organizations down that path of retribution to desire extracting that pound of flesh. How does an organization start about combating that?
Right. The first step, as I suggested initially, was to hold your breath, as in not feel that you need to act immediately. The second is to actually be aware of and then develop for yourself a viable alternative, because leaders are not going to throw out a strategy that has patently not been working, but they won't throw it out on the evidence of it not working, because if they don't have something to replace it, you cannot ask a leader to throw out a paradigm. I mean, Tom Kuhn wrote about this, way back in the Structure of Scientific Revolutions, right, which sold better than the Bible, by the way, right? And so it's been quite a popular book. That people will not give up a paradigm that is a framework of thinking if there's not a viable alternative to take its place. And the viable alternative exists, right? For those of you who've read Just Culture, the third edition, will know that or seen the Just Culture movie for that matter, will know that the viable alternative is, instead of retribution, it is restoration. It is, it's the type of thing that the hop nerds do when they begin a learning review, which is non-judgmental, which is about discovery, about curiosity, about open-mindedness, about learning about normal work. Right. Now, but the very clear distinction is this, right? If you have a retributive just culture, and it's even sort of a contradiction in terms, but which a lot of people in the U.S. are selling, as if you can solve it this way, which basically asks three questions, right? Which rule was broken? How bad was that breach? And thus, what should the consequences be? Yeah. And then what you get in some of these products that people sell off the shelf, which is an extraordinarily bad idea, is that they give you the impression that you can answer, particularly that second question, right? How bad was that breach? By sort of categorizing or pigeonholing human behavior. It's a true McDonaldization of justice. Well, is it this box, or would you like a double burger on it? I mean, they're not serving anyone right now, really. It makes it utterly superficial, and it doesn't solve anything, because it leaves the hard question for the people who need to make that judgment. Well, which box are we going to stick it in? Is this at-risk behavior? Have they done it before? Have they done it before? Well, yeah, probably, because otherwise it doesn't get the job done. So you either follow all the rules, or you do the bloody job, right? And leaders who don't recognize that, and by the way, that's sort of an underlying, what's the right word? An underlying realization and empathy and compassion that they need to get to understand that, there is a distance between, as Eric Holnagel beautifully calls, right, a gap between work is imagined in your head as a leader and work is actually done, where the guys are doing things. The workers are doing things to deliver you the objective of the organization and live up to its mission. if they were going to follow all the rules, they're not going to get the job done, right? And we know this in the work to rule strike. Air traffic controllers are really good at it. Right? So yeah, back to the question of how bad was the breach. There's breaches all the time. Otherwise, you can't get work done. And most often, these breaches don't lead to anything except a completed job, right? So if a leader doesn't get that, there is no point in engaging them in a discussion around an alternative paradigm for just culture. That said, what is the alternative? The alternative is three very different questions. Which is who is impacted by this? What do they need? And whose obligation is it to meet that need? All right. And that leads to a completely different conversation. It doesn't mean that people don't suffer consequences, right? Because they do. Having to, for example, fess up and tell your colleagues or wider organization about your involvement in an evolving incident can be both hugely cathartic, hugely punitive, hugely embarrassing. And yet it is a contribution to learning and quality improvement for everyone, right? And so again, the stupidest thing is to fire the person involved because, as John Allspot, one of my students once put it, an incident is an investment that you have already made, all right? You might as well get your damn return on investment.
Right. You need to squeeze the money out of it at this point, right?
Squeeze it out of it, which means don't kick the person out who was involved because they're the embodiment of the lesson, right?
Right. Well, in that particular example, as you said, as we start to ask better questions that move us down a more restorative approach, isn't that really creating an environment of more accountability? If we take a restorative approach, because not to grossly oversimplify this, but especially on the backside of that, after the organization has responded to that event, and we've asked those questions, we've responded to those questions, and we move into the process of learning. Often, as we kind of move down the learning review or learning team model, we're involving the folks that the event happened to more often than not. And, we're asking those folks to come together and solve that problem. That seems like a pretty high accountability environment to me.
I think, Sam, that you have all of science behind you. If you see accountability and an account in sort of financial or literally accounting terms, and a leader thinks like that, then they would come back to you and say, no, that's not accountability. But I think they've got the wrong end. Accounting is about telling, is about showing, is about giving an explanation for, right? Whether it's the figures in your annual books or whether it's a story that you tell about your involvement in an incident. Accounting to each other and accountability to each other is about telling stories and learning from those stories. Again, whether the story is in words or pictures or figures, doesn't matter. An account is something you tell, right? And if you are not able to move there and you stick with this belief that an account is something you have to settle or pay, you're never going to bloody get it. You're not going to get it.
Right. How much of this, and we talked several different things there. We really talked about the desire to blame folks post-event, really the views around human error. We talked about response a little bit. Incident investigation, whatever we want to call it. How much of this comes from the desire to oversimplify things?
Nietzsche has talked about that beautifully. Who writes inscrutably himself too, by the way. But the idea, that he proposed was that this search for cause is an oversimplification, not necessarily because of the virtue of oversimplification itself, but oversimplification serves an important goal, and that goal is the sense of control and a controllable universe, and the idea that we can do things so that we don't end up in bad situations ourselves. And that is where blame comes in really handily, right? If we can attach the reasons for why things went wrong to attributes of that particular individual, then every time we do that, we automatically write ourselves free, and say, oh, well, I don't have that attribute, so that won't happen to me. And Sam, I think that even happens right now with the folks, who unfortunately get COVID-19. We probably go, oh, they probably shook someone's hand or stood too close or went for bagels somewhere or, and so even there, and even though we tell ourselves not to be that judgmental, even if we can educate ourselves to not oversimplify, the thirst for control, for having a sense of being able to influence the universe in which we live so that we don't meet the fate of other unfortunate people, it is, according to Nietzsche, right, what drives all of this.
Right. I think it's interesting too, because we touched on this desire to do things, right? And a lot of times it ends up being wielding of the stick towards a wrongdoer. But organizations in general, they almost seem to, not almost, they really do seem to over-respond when events occur quite often. And it seems to lead us down this path of increased bureaucracy in and around the organization. We end up with corrective actions that end up being stand down this, retrain those, do this, do that, another form here, another check sheet there. It's all ultimately seems like it's really stemming from blame, because it seems like we're weaponizing human performance at that point. It seems like we're really saying, well, if you would have just used that checklist a little harder, then nothing bad would have happened. If you would have just done a pre-task brief just a little bit harder, then nothing bad would have happened. Most organizations that are starting down this path are really starting to realize all this clutter that exists in their organization now, and starting to realize that it's not very useful to where they're trying to go. So how do you start down the path of decluttering in your organization? Because it seems like that's most of the organizations that I hear from, most of the practitioners that I talk to, even several years back in my normal day job, I come into contact with this quite a bit. That there seems to be more rules, more forms, more check sheets than we know what to do with, almost to the point to where it really harms more than it helps.
So let me respond to that question first by saying there's a new book on the way that explains even better, I hope, than the recent one, The Safety Anarchist, that I hope some of the Hope nerds will have read. I love writing that book, by the way, The Safety Anarchist. That was just such a fun polemic. But so there's another one on the way soon that will dive into this. I think you, in order to answer that question, Sam, let's divide it up into the psychological and the practical, right? How do you start decluttering? The first is to find what psychological need increasing clutter has for leaders in the organization. Because if it didn't have a type of psychological need for them, it probably wouldn't happen, right? Because I think most Hop nerds who are on the cast would be able to agree that they would be able to show that increased clutter leads to decreased productivity. That tool time goes down, right? That the workers need to spend more time filling in forms rather than actually fixing the job. That, I've seen some jobs where tool time is down to 2 hours and 50 minutes a day, because of all the crap that sits on both ends of it. And so it's an astounding productivity loss. And so, but apparently that's not good enough of an argument, because the psychological factors that drive clutter need to be understood by Hop nerds who really want to get their heads around this. And then we'll talk about the practical things in a second. But the psychological need, Sam, is this. It's once again the need for control and liability management on the part of leadership. Now, the way to start attacking that as a Hop nerd is to tell the leader, look, give me the evidence that this piece of clutter is what the regulator or your lawyers are asking for. And it turns out, but this is a very hard road to walk. And, we're walking it in various parallel ways in order to get some mileage. But one of the things that we're doing is saying, look, more clutter actually doesn't, first of all, it's not what the regulator asks. The regulator really doesn't give a damn about the 5 points on your little checklist, right? They don't care what is on your checklist. What they care about is that you have a safety management system in place that gives them the confidence that you know what the hell you're doing, right? If you then come back and you're not doing what you have promised them in your safety management system, yeah, well, then you're screwed, of course, right? Well, I mean, that's so obvious. So go back to the safety management system and don't promise that much, right? And so I remember the Woolworths experiment, right? I was amazed when we found this out. For those of you who've seen the film Safety Differently, right? The documentary, right? If you haven't, you got to watch it, right?
Absolutely.
I mean, it's from 2017 and it's freely available. It's got like tens of thousands of views. So talk of the town, right? So that documentary has got the Woolworths experiment in it. And what we found out was that the regulators involved in this organization, actually, ultimately, when we stripped it all bare, right? Because they have rules coming out the wazoo, you know, I mean, what mops to use for cleaning up, what types of spills, how many times to wipe off the glass pane of the chicken deli counter. I mean, it was bizarre, you know, as if, you know, well, people cannot think for themselves, so we're going to write it all up. It's a completely Tayloristic universe, right? 1911, Taylor saying, workers are dumb, right? Managers and planners are smart, and consultants are even smarter because managers aren't that smart, so they buy consultancy to tell them, oh, you should be wiping your chicken glass, you know, every 23 minutes under these temperature conditions, and so utterly bizarre. Right? Taking away the sheer professionalism and joy and autonomy of the people actually doing work, you know. But you know, that's a different story. But anyway, so what was really cool was to discover that we started digging into this, and we said, okay, well, let's pull out the legislation, right? And then let's pull out the regulations that this legislation leads to. And the regulations really didn't care about cleaning. It doesn't say anything, right? And so the interesting thing was that the only thing that they required was that the organization has a safety management system, and that it, you know, within that safety management system, there's some relative consistency between what you do and what you say that you'll do, but that is sort of understood. And the other thing is that they needed fire exit signs above the doors. Federal requirement, couldn't negotiate that one away. That was it. That was all that was needed, Sam. And so the rest was all self-imposed, you know. And when you look at the research, 60%, up to 60% in mature economies like the US of compliance requirements are now self-imposed. It's because of business-to-business requirements, because of contractor-to-client requirements. It's because of internal audit and accountability requirements. All this crap, you know, there's no regulator. I promise you, there is no regulator that asks my university to ask me to show my taxi receipt for $23 for, you know, which then needs to get signed by 4 levels above me or something. You know, the regulator really has other things to do. You know? And besides, given the type of governance we've had in the last 40 years, particularly in the US, the regulator doesn't have enough people. You know, you've stripped them bare. Right? It's even been voices to lay down OSHA altogether. You know, so out of some of the more libertarian circles. So so do a reality check with your leadership and say, well, hang on, right? What is it that they're actually asking you to do? And how much of it are you imposing yourself? Once they begin to see that, in that they have strung red tape in their own way, so that their productivity harms and they, in fact, fail to meet other important goals that keep them in the seat as a leader, I think you get some motivation and you can start to deal with that psychology of it, right? So that's the psychological part. Then the practical part is but you know, a learning team would be a great place. And you help nerds know exactly how to do that. Is to sit down and just ask the following question. What is the stupidest thing that you need to do to work here every day? Start there.
And that's, I love that. You know, I grew up in power generation, nuclear power generation in particular. So I'm painfully aware of this. If you just follow the rules, everything will be okay kind of mindset. It's like we continue to try to drive towards this perfect black line. And then we continue to kind of audit people against that black line when bad things happen and say, well, see, if you would have just been a little more in compliance, if you would have just followed the plan on wiping that glass 6 times, then nothing bad would have happened. You had just touched on it just for a second in the space of kind of rules versus autonomy. And what do you think around organizations? You know, we just mentioned that, or you just mentioned that about 60% of a lot of this stuff is just self-imposed. Is it just a desire for the organization to keep a grip, or is it something else? Is it something else entirely?
I think, I mean, back to Nietzsche, I think it's fear of liability, fear of being held accountable, not being able to come up with a good answer.
Right.
Well, you know about this incident, or you know about this LTI, you know, what did you do about it? And you said, well, if you feel that you need to be able to say something, well, we put up some posters. Oh, that sounds like a good intervention, right? BS. Posters are the worst intervention, right? In fact, this should be the Hop Nerd's first assignment. When you go in an organization, rip the damn things off the walls, okay? Because they have nothing to contribute other than telling other people to try a little harder, right?
Exactly.
I mean, they are the
It is always that. It seems like it is always this conversation of you should care more, you should be more, you should try harder, and if you do, bad things will stop happening. And then we take that those same sayings and put them on banners, and then we put them on screensavers. We think we're going to care our way into eliminating human error.
Exactly. We set people up for failure. We give them shitty equipment to work with that's not error tolerant. You know, we give them significant time pressure. We don't give them health insurance, which means they're probably half sick. You know, they need to care for 3 kids at home. You know, whatever, right? We pile all these pressures on, and then it goes wrong. We go, well, why did you make a poor choice? It's screwed up. Yeah. But Max Weber said this 120 years ago, man. We should have known by now.
We're finally catching on. It's interesting because you bring up all of those pressures that folks face on a daily basis as they go out and they negotiate this work. And to me, what has always been interesting and what really piques my curiosity and what drove me down this path is that you could take the rule book and we could drag it into the parking lot and burn it, and folks would still get it right the majority of the time.
Hell yeah. Oh yeah. And this has been proven, Sam. I mean, so remember the high reliability guys, right, up in Northern California. Right. I mean, what was their first world that sort of shocked them into the realization that what you just said was true? Right. Was the introduction of the Tomcat onto the deck, right, of the aircraft carriers. Now the Tomcat, I mean, it's a big jet, right? It's like half the size of an Airbus, weighs like 30 tons. It's got all kinds of life stuff hanging off the wings, and it's got to land on the runway, the size of your computer screen, right? And and so they started to say, well, when you introduce this jet, obviously, where was the rule book for it to do that safely, right? And the Navy guys come back and say, I mean, and by the way, I know that the nuclear Navy has got a lot of influence over nuclear power generation in the U.S., but they took a very different mindset into it. But the aircraft carrier guys come back and say, rules? No, there were no rules. We fly the thing over, we give it a try, doesn't work, we go around, do another one. Rules follow practice, right? And this is from the 1970s, these findings, right? We can't all of a sudden wake up and say, oh, we didn't know about that. Well, read, people, read. And
it seems like at some point our organizations have forgotten that a procedure, as an example, is supposed to be a tool that helps us to accomplish work, not something that ties our hands and slows us down. Because it just seems that human nature will be to circumvent that process if it impacts our efficiency, right?
Well, not only human nature, but organizational nature. Sure. I mean, an organization can't survive if that's the script by which it lives. Right. And even in nuclear power, we know this, Sam, despite its own protestations and say, oh no, we've got, we don't do a manual, we do shelves of manuals, right? And so what's this nonsense of having a procedure? No, you get this wrong. We have bookcases, right? And so now you guys are off the chart. But the Swedes came up with a beautiful realization, which they started to call malicious compliance. Right? Swedes were generating about 60% of their power from nuclear some time ago, and so that's pretty important in that country. And so malicious compliance. I mean, just let that one sit on the tongue for a little bit. You go, what, huh? That was the leader telling their people, right? No, this is malicious compliance. How can compliance be malicious, right? So it's the whole organization is a contradiction in its own terms, right? You can't work and follow all the rules, right? Great example, by the way, for those who work in healthcare, typical ward nurse needs to follow our colleagues down at Macquarie University did the study. They stopped counting at 600 rules, right? So a ward nurse, just a ward nurse, needs to follow 600 rules. They stopped counting them. Then they asked the ward nurse, so how many rules can you recite back to us, right? And the nurse goes, there's got to be something about hand washing. It's a hospital after all. There's probably something about, I don't know, patient ID check or something, stick the wrong chemicals into the wrong bodies. And then, there's probably about, stacking dishes in the break room or something. Do you know that the average nurse could recite between 2 and 3 rules? Which means 597 rules are just gobbledygook nonsense made up by some occupational health and safety or other, input, which has no resemblance to actual work. Right. So anyway, I could go on about that.
I think it's interesting because the way that we see some of this stuff manifest in my world is that we see these kind of lists of most sacreds that come out of the rules. And it's interesting because I always challenge organizations with that if you have so many rules that you have to come up with 5 or 10 that are extra special, then you might have too many rules right to begin with. But it kind of leads us down this conversation is that when we have something not so great happen, and we kind of go back and we dig through, and of course we find where somebody didn't follow the rule, or they forgot a rule, or they missed something, or they had a poor judgment, whatever we want to call it, right? And then we hold them to that rule after the event. We extract our pound of flesh, or we go through and we basically say, you should have done this, you could have done this, what if you would have done this? What impact does that really have on reporting of events and learning overall within an organization?
It's utterly intuitive, the answer to that one. It kills it. It kills it. It kills it. So if you're a hop nerd and you go into an organization, I think one of the highest goals should be to help the organization get rid of its most sacred, its golden rules, its 10 special safety rules, or whatever the heck it might be, for a very simple reason. First, these rules are often so intuitive. Don't smoke, don't walk under a suspended load. You go, really? Right? I mean, in medieval times, we had myths about these things, right? Don't look at a black cat, because you'd be bewitched. Don't walk under a ladder, I mean, so we've made up, and in fact, even in biblical times, we've got 10 rules by which to live, don't envy your neighbor's ox, or something. And so these rules change as with the times, but they're mostly utterly intuitive. And so but there's an intermediate step because many people come back and say, well, the organization I'm working with is not willing to give them up. The least you can do is try to convince them to get rid of the punitive management that happens after the supposed or putative violation of those rules, because that's what kills it. Right? It's not necessarily the existence of these guidelines, or if you think that's pretty posters with yellow colors on it, here's our most 10 important rules. I wonder how anybody would looks at it, but it doesn't matter. And by the way, how many leaders can recite them back to you? Because just check that. Can you give me your 10 rules? I've done this. Right? They come up short. They're like 3 or something. So it's so cute. And then of course they start bumbling. It's all middle management's fault. Or they don't apply to me because I sit in an office on my duff all day. But the research is crystal clear on this. I mean, Cody Pitzer puts it beautifully, right? If you have punitive management after the supposed violation, again, I hate that word, but deviation from or variation from these life-saving or golden rules or most sacred rules, you shut up your organization. You create, as Cody Pitzer said, a culture of risk secrecy. Right. And I find that chilling, Sam. I'll give you an example. So I was working on a site where the site manager tells me, I mean, it's a hot climate where this was. So, you go, okay, I understand this. No, I'm not coming out the shack, right? You go, well, why are you not coming out the shack, right? Aren't you, right? We go back to DuPont, which is a bad idea, but, go back to DuPont, visible field leadership, and all of that, right? And so field leadership, no, we don't do I don't do field leadership. And I said, so why'd you come out the shack? He says, if I come out the shack, the first thing that I'll see is guys violating the golden rules, which means I have to fire them, which means my project is not getting completed in time. So I hear no evil, I see no evil, I smell no evil. I shut my face, my nose, my mouth. It's, I'm hunkering down, not for COVID-19, but because I need to get stuff done. If that doesn't indicate a culture of risk secrecy and sort of these two parallel universes, right, where you've got an organization as it is imagined in leaders and boards and sort of the accountability processes that they live by versus the actual organization, man, I don't know what is.
Yeah, and that's what I've always found interesting about that is that we take, usually it's the things that we know kill and maim people in our organizations, and we create that fancy poster that you just mentioned. We plaster it on the wall, then we start firing people for violations. And what we don't really, or what the organization seems to not understand, is that we're creating exactly that. That's exactly it. We're creating a silence around the things that can kill our people, the things that do kill our people in our industries. And then we're shocked that people aren't reporting things because
we're shocked when they're killed.
Right, exactly. We're completely surprised. Well, and I think it kind of leads into this last kind of thought that I wanted to ask you about. We often measure these violations. We often measure, everything. And again, back to power generation. That's been my career for the vast majority of my life. We like to measure more than most. We tend to believe that if we can just observe enough and trend a graph enough, if we can just get people to report enough close calls, if we can just get people to report enough first aids, that we'll finally be able to begin forecasting when bad things will happen, that we'll finally be able to predict the next fatality. What would you say to folks out there that cling to that idea that this data has a good predictive capacity?
It doesn't have a good predictive capacity.
So you were saying you can use profanity if you like. No.
I was trying to be very polite. No, the research is crystal clear on this, Sam. It has crappy predictive capacity. In fact, it probably predicts the wrong way. First of all, if you're measuring violations, right, you're only measuring the numerator, not the denominator, right? Because it's always a ratio, right? You can't see everything, right? And so there's violations going on all the time. Otherwise, work can't get done. Remember the nurses, 597 rules they didn't even know about, right? And so they're probably violating them and getting on with caring for patients, particularly now. So that sort of measurement is utterly useless. No, but as we have seen, and René Alberti has been very clear in the statistical basis for this, as your organization gets safer, the gap between how people are injured versus how they are killed grows dramatically, right? And so counting and measuring injuries as if they have some predictive capacity for the big one is nonsense. And if you're a really unsafe operation, like mountaineering in the Himalayas, how you get injured is pretty much how you die, because when you're injured, you do die, probably, right? So, but the two overlap quite nicely. But and a lot of people anyway. So, but if you're 10 to the minus 6, if you have one bad incident in a million events or something, then injuries have no predictive capacities. And in fact, the fewer injuries you have, the more likely it is you're going to have a fatality. Look at Macondo, right? Which had a dubious anniversary just not long ago, right? Was it last week?
It was,
I mean, terrible. And and we all feel for the guys and the families involved in these awful things. But so my recommendation is both to leaders and the hop nerds is, if you want to predict the next fatality, look at normal work. And you are already doing that, because what we have learned, right, from all the fatalities that I've been a part of investigating, and I think others have, I know Todd has, right, they come from normal work, normal people doing normal work under normal circumstances of constraints, pressures, goal conflicts. And what we need to understand is why they are normally successful. How do they actually get this done normally? And if we don't understand that, we won't understand anything about the sacrifices they're making to get there, to make it so. Because you need to make sacrifices to get stuff done in the real world, right? Because we don't live in a perfect world. We don't live in a world where you can write rules for how it's going to run, because it's too complex, too unpredictable. too curvebally, right?
Right.
And so
Right.
it's so look at normal work, understand the sacrifices people make to get stuff done, and that will lead you to how people are going to get killed. Don't get in a tizzy about incidents or injuries or counts, because statistically they're below the noticeable difference anyway, completely.
Right. And that, because that's interesting. That's a place where many organizations, many people get hung up on. I'm sure it's, as you're aware, I get tons of hate mail because I like to pick on this whole notion of zero. quite a bit.
Don't get me started.
I get tons. I won't get you down there. I know you have to go in just a moment. I won't. But you would be.
My word.
You may or may not be shocked or surprised that just the amount of safety practitioners that do still cling to that idea of zero, or to this idea that managing lower level events prevents larger events. There's still a lot of folks that cling to that.
It's a myth. It's been proven wrong. Again, the safer the system gets, the stupider the idea becomes. Having a zero ambition is right out dangerous. All right. It's a relic. It belongs to a previous century, and it was always a bad idea, right? We have to ditch it. If we're not moving as a profession, Sam, and rally all the hop nerds we can find to flush zero down the loo, I wouldn't be proud of who we are.
Right. Well, and with on that note, this is kind of our famous question around here. I don't quite know how it came about, but any last words? Any final words, any pro tips or any knowledge or wisdom that you'd like to impart on hop practitioners or leaders or safety folks out there, that any go-dos for them, anything that you would like to share with them before we go?
Sam, I think that what I would want to tell all the hop nerds, because this is in family, right? We're this amazing community that is driven by a lot of research and insights and scholarship from a lot of different people. Ultimately, what it boils down to, though, is we need to convince leaders and others in organization to once again have trust in their fellow human beings, to not have systems of mistrust and accountability that run on, I don't trust you to do the right thing, right? All kinds of rules and checklists because I don't know whether I can trust you, behind my back. And if that's the starting point that we're trying to get hop into organizations with, it's not going to work, right? We have to get people to trust each other again. And I think in the crisis in which we right now are, you see both sides of that coin, right? You see mistrust and people throwing mud at each other and calling each other idiot. And on the other hand, you see amazing acts of human compassion and kindness and trust and a willingness to help and a reaching out and saying, you are my fellow human being. We're in this together, right? I think ultimately, if hop nerds can help spread that message of hope, of trust, of being inspired by what your fellow people do rather than being fearful of it, of to use the Greek words, a philanthropic mindset, your belief in the goodness of human beings rather than this misanthropic mindset, right? This belief in the badness and the bad motives of your fellow human beings. Man, we could change the world, Sam. We could change the world.
Wow. Yeah, absolutely everything would change, right? Well, thank you, sir. Thank you so much for coming on. Sidney Dekker, ladies and gentlemen, everyone out there, again, thank you so much for joining us. I know our hop nerds, our listeners, our leaders, all those folks that tune in, they'll absolutely love this one to death. So thank you once again.
Pleasure. Happy to do it, Sam.
Absolutely.